Meet Sarah and Marcus. Same city. Same age. Same take-home pay. And every single month, both of them do something most people never manage to do consistently. They each set aside exactly $1,000. Same amount. Same discipline. Same starting line. 10 years later, one of them is sitting on a number that quietly changed their entire life. The other one is wondering why it didn't work. Same inputs. Completely different outputs. And the difference has nothing to do with intelligence, luck, or finding some secret investment nobody told you about. It comes down to one misunderstanding about what $1,000 a month actually builds over a decade. A misunderstanding so common, so deeply baked into how most people think about saving, that almost nobody catches it until it's already cost them years. My name is Nick, and I've spent more time than I'd like to admit running these numbers, reading the studies, and trying to figure out why two people can do the exact same thing with money and end up in completely different places. If you've ever set aside money every month and felt like the math just wasn't adding up the way you expected, hit subscribe. Because today we're going to walk through exactly what $1,000 a month actually produces over 10 years, the real number, the psychology behind why most people guess wrong, and the specific mistake that turns a decade of discipline into a decade of disappointment. And I'll tell you right now, the real number is almost certainly not what you're picturing. For some of you it's going to be higher. For others, it's going to feel lower than it should be. Either way, the reason why is the most important part of this entire conversation. Let's start with the guess. If you asked 100 people on the street what $1,000 a month for 10 years adds up to, most of them would do the same mental math. $1,000. 12 months. 10 years. That's $120,000. Some people would round up slightly, maybe throw in a rough idea of interest, and land somewhere around $130,000 or $140,000. And they'd feel pretty good about that answer. It's logical. It's tidy. It's also only half the picture. Because the number they're calculating is the contribution number. The money they personally put in. And while that number is real, it's not the number that matters. The number that matters is what that money becomes when it's invested. And that's where the gap opens up between what people expect and what actually happens. Here's the real number. $1,000 a month invested consistently over 10 years, assuming a 7% average annual return, which is a conservative estimate based on historical stock market performance, not a guarantee, but a reasonable benchmark, grows to roughly $173,000. Sit with that for a second. You put in $120,000. You end up with $173,000. That's over $50,000 that you never earned, never worked for, never sacrificed a single weekend to produce. It appeared because money was sitting in the right place long enough to do its job. That's not a small detail. That's more than 5 years of maxed-out Roth IRA contributions showing up for free. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting. Because that number, $173,000, is both more impressive than most people expect and simultaneously not as impressive as it could be. And the reason it's not as impressive as it could be is where Sarah and Marcus split apart. Let's talk about Sarah first. Sarah opens a high-yield savings account. She's proud of herself, and she should be. She sets up the automatic transfer, $1,000 every month without fail, and she doesn't touch it. 10 years of perfect discipline. 0 missed months. When she checks her balance at the end of year 10, she sees something around $128,000. Maybe $130,000 with a little interest depending on the rate environment. She did everything right. She saved more consistently than 90% of Americans. And yet she feels a specific kind of frustration she can't quite name. She put in $120,000. She got back $128,000. A decade of discipline produced about $8,000 in gains. That's not a savings problem. That's a placement problem. A savings account, even a good one, is not an investment. It's a parking spot. And money parked in a savings account is money that shows up to work every day and sits in the break room. It's safe. It's accessible. But it's not building anything. It's barely keeping up with inflation, which means in purchasing power terms, Sarah's $128,000 might actually buy less than the $120,000 she put in would have bought 10 years ago. That's the first version of the misunderstanding. People conflate saving with investing. They use the words interchangeably. They feel the discipline of setting money aside and assume the discipline alone is what produces wealth. It isn't. Discipline is the entry fee. Where you put the money is the actual game. Now let's talk about Marcus. Marcus invests his $1,000 a month. Not in anything exotic. Not in individual stocks he read about on a forum. He puts it into a simple, low-cost index fund that tracks the broad market. He automates it the same way Sarah automated her transfers. And he does something that sounds easy but is genuinely one of the hardest things in personal finance. He doesn't watch it obsessively. He doesn't pull it out when the market drops 15% and his stomach drops with it. He just lets it run. End of year 10, Marcus has $173,000. Same income. Same monthly amount. Same 10 years. Marcus has $45,000 more than Sarah. Not because he was smarter or worked harder. Because his money had a job. But here's what I really want you to understand, because the raw number comparison isn't actually the most important part of this story. The most important part is what's happening inside those 10 years, month by month, that most people never stop to visualize. In year 1, Marcus's monthly investment returns are almost invisible. He puts in $1,000. The market returns 7% annually. That's less than $6 in growth his first month. $6. It feels like a joke. It feels like the math is broken. And this is exactly the moment when most people start to doubt whether it's worth it. They're doing everything right and the scoreboard barely moves. This is what I call the slog zone. And it's where most people quit. But here's what they don't see because they're too busy staring at the small numbers. Underneath those barely moving balances, a machine is being assembled. Every month another gear clicks into place. The contributions stack. The base grows. And at some point, it's not dramatic, there's no bell that rings, the machine turns on. By year 5, Marcus has somewhere around $71,000 invested. And at that point, a 7% annual return is generating roughly $5,000 a year on its own. That's almost $420 a month appearing in his account from investments alone. He's still contributing his $1,000. But now the portfolio is quietly kicking in nearly half that amount as a bonus. Every month. Without him doing anything at all. By year 8, the portfolio is generating more in monthly returns than Marcus is contributing himself. His money has officially outpaced him. He's the junior partner in his own wealth-building operation. The money is running the show. This is the visual that changes everything when people actually see it. Your contributions don't just stack. They multiply. And the multiplying doesn't feel like much for a long time. Then all at once, it does. Now here's where we need to have a real conversation, because understanding the number and understanding what actually threatens the number are two different things. There are 3 specific ways people take a decade of disciplined investing and accidentally hollow it out from the inside. And if you're nodding along to everything I've said so far and thinking this is exactly what I'm already doing, you need to hear this part especially. The first killer is fees. It sounds boring. It sounds like the kind of thing only accountants care about. It is also, without exaggeration, one of the most financially destructive forces in a long-term investor's life. Here's the math. 2 funds. Same $1,000 monthly contribution. Same 7% gross return. One charges 0.05% in annual fees, the kind you find in most major index funds. The other charges 1.5%, the kind you find in many actively managed funds that get sold to people who don't know to ask about expenses. After 10 years, the difference is around $10,000. That's $10,000 that quietly vanished into the pockets of a fund manager whose fund probably didn't even beat the index anyway. Over 30 years, that same fee difference doesn't cost you $30,000. It costs you closer to $150,000. Because fees compound exactly the same way returns do. They just compound in the wrong direction. This is why the most boring investment advice, by low-cost index funds, is also the most powerful investment advice. Not because index funds are magic. Because they don't steal the magic that compounding is already doing for you. The second killer is timing. Or more accurately, the attempt to time. Markets go down. This is not a prediction or a risk. It is a certainty. At some point in any 10-year investing window, the market will fall. Probably more than once. And when it does, something happens in the human brain that is both completely understandable and completely counterproductive. The brain reads falling prices as danger. It says sell. Get out. Wait until it stabilizes and then get back in. It frames this as logic, as prudence, as protecting what you've built. But what it's actually doing is locking in losses and guaranteeing you'll miss the recovery. There's a study I come back to constantly on this. Researchers at Fidelity once looked at their best-performing accounts over a multi-year period to try to identify what those investors had in common. What they found was almost darkly funny. The best-performing accounts belonged to people who had either forgotten they had the account or were dead. The investors who won were the ones who weren't there to interfere. I'm not telling you to be dead. I'm telling you that the behavior gap, the difference between what a fund returns and what the average investor in that fund actually earns, exists almost entirely because people can't stop themselves from reacting. They sell low. They buy back in high. They repeat it. And every cycle costs them a piece of the number Marcus quietly built by doing almost nothing. The third killer is the upgrade. This one is quieter than the other two, and it does its damage so slowly that most people don't notice until they're standing at the end of a decade wondering why the number isn't bigger. Here's what happens. You start investing $1,000 a month. A year in, you get a raise. Not a huge one. Maybe $400 more per month after tax. And you think, well, I'm already investing. I deserve to enjoy this a little. The car payment goes up. The apartment gets slightly nicer. The restaurant budget quietly doubles. The raise disappears into lifestyle before it ever had a chance to become wealth. This is the hedonic treadmill doing what it always does. Every upgrade feels like a reward. And within about 6 months, the upgrade just becomes normal. The pleasure is gone but the cost remains. And that $400 a month, $4,800 a year, that could have been added to the investment machine just quietly got absorbed. Over 10 years, assuming that $400 extra per month had been invested instead, we're talking about an additional $66,000 at a 7% return. That's not a small choice. That's a fully loaded car. That's a year of financial independence. That's the difference between a number that changes something about your life and a number that just sits there looking okay. So let's bring Sarah and Marcus back together one more time. Because I want to leave you with the version of this story that I think actually matters. At the end of year 10, Marcus doesn't feel dramatically different from the person he was at the start. He drives the same kind of car. He lives in a reasonable apartment. He didn't feel himself getting wealthier month by month because the machine was too quiet to notice. But when he actually looks at the number, $173,000, something shifts. He runs the next 10 years forward in his head. Same contributions. Same boring index funds. Same patience. Year 20, roughly $520,000. Year 30, somewhere north of $1.2 million. He didn't get rich in 10 years. But in 10 years he built the foundation that makes the next 20 almost inevitable. The snowball is over the top of the hill. And now it rolls. Sarah looks at her $128,000 and makes a decision that is the most valuable thing she's ever done with money. She moves it. Not into something complicated. Not into something her coworker told her about. Into the same boring, low-cost index fund Marcus has been using for 10 years. She just needed to see the gap to understand what was causing it. Here's the reframe I want to leave you with. $1,000 a month isn't a savings plan. It's a workforce. Every dollar you send into a well-placed investment is a new employee who shows up on time, never calls in sick, never asks for a raise, and quietly reports back to work 365 days a year. In year 1, you've got a small team and the output is modest. By year 10, you've got a department. By year 20, you've got a company working for you while you sleep. Most people spend their entire lives working for money. The whole point of this, the index fund, the low fees, the automatic contribution, the patience through the drops, is to slowly, quietly, boringly reverse that relationship. Until the money works for you harder than you ever worked for it. You don't need a windfall. You don't need a secret. You don't need a better salary before you start. You need $1,000 a month, the right place to put it, and the discipline to leave it alone long enough for the machine to run. That's the whole thing. A quick note before you go. None of this is financial advice and I'm not a financial advisor. These are patterns and numbers I find genuinely fascinating, and I share them the same way I'd share them with a friend over coffee. Take what's useful and run your own numbers. If this changed how you think about where your money is sitting right now, drop a comment and tell me, are you closer to Sarah or Marcus? I actually read every single one. And if you want to understand what happens to that $173,000 once it crosses the next threshold, the level where the math stops being interesting and starts being life-changing, that video is right there on the screen. Go watch that one next.